The morning sun beat down hard on the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in San Diego, California. The heat made the air shimmer above the concrete buildings, and the smell of gun oil mixed with dust filled the air around the shooting ranges. Commander Jake Morrison stood behind the firing line, his arms crossed as he watched his team of Navy SEALs prepare for their weekly marksmanship training. These men were the best of the best, hand-picked warriors who had survived the toughest military training in the world. Today, they would compete against each other to see who could claim the monthly accuracy championship, a title that came with bragging rights and a small trophy that sat in the team room. Petty Officer First Class Nick Carter knelt beside his rifle, checking the scope settings one more time. His weapon was a state-of-the-art precision rifle with the latest technology, worth more than most people made in a year. The scope could calculate wind speed, distance, and even the rotation of the Earth to help make the perfect shot. Nick had won the championship 3 months in a row and planned to make it 4. He looked over at his teammate Alex Turner, who was cleaning his rifle barrel with careful strokes. Alex was good, very good. But Nick knew he had the edge when it came to long-distance shooting. The range itself stretched out for nearly a mile, with targets placed at different distances starting from 100 meters and going all the way out to 800 meters. Electronic scoring systems tracked every shot and displayed the results on screens that everyone could see. The targets themselves were military standard, with scoring rings that got smaller toward the center. A perfect shot, called a 10, required hitting the bullseye dead center. Even these elite soldiers rarely shot perfect scores when the distances got longer and the wind started to pick up. Paul Davis, a sergeant with 10 years of experience, loaded his magazine with 20 rounds of match-grade ammunition. Each bullet was made to exact specifications with powder charges measured to the grain. Paul liked to talk, and he often made jokes about civilian shooters who thought they understood what real marksmanship meant. He had grown up hunting in Texas and believed that military training had made him one of the finest shooters in the country. His confidence was not misplaced. Paul regularly outshot police officers and competitive shooters who visited the range. Lieutenant Scott Williams walked down the line. Checking each man's equipment and position, Scott was the team leader, responsible for making sure everyone followed safety rules and maintained their skills. He had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, where accurate shooting meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. Scott took training seriously because he knew that in real combat, there would be no second chances to get it right. His own rifle sat nearby, already zeroed and ready for his turn at the targets. Range Master Lisa Grant checked her watch and prepared to call the line hot, which meant the shooters could begin firing. Lisa had been running this range for 8 years and had seen thousands of military personnel come and go. She knew good shooting when she saw it, and she knew that even among SEALs there were different levels of skill. Some men were natural shooters who could hit anything they aimed at, while others had to work hard to meet the minimum standards. Lisa respected all of them because she understood the pressure they faced and the importance of their training. While the SEALs focused on their equipment and talked among themselves, an old pickup truck pulled into the visitor parking area outside the range facility. The truck was clean but showed its age, with a few small dents and faded paint that spoke of many years of reliable service. The driver sat for a moment, looking through the windshield at the buildings ahead. Henry Walsh was 72 years old, with gray hair and hands that showed the wear of decades of hard work. He wore a simple flannel shirt despite the heat, old blue jeans that were clean but faded, and work boots that had seen better days. Henry reached into the back seat and pulled out a leather case that was almost as old as he was. The case was worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it, and the brass corners had turned green with age. Inside the case, wrapped in soft cloth, lay a rifle that had been made before most of the SEALs on the range were born. It was an M1 Garand, the same type of weapon that American soldiers had carried in World War II and Korea. Henry had maintained this rifle for over 50 years, cleaning it after every use and storing it properly, so that it remained in perfect working condition. He walked slowly toward the range building, carrying the case in one hand and moving with the careful pace of a man who had learned not to hurry, unless he had to. Henry had driven down from Los Angeles, where he lived alone in a small house that he had bought with his military pension and savings from 40 years of work as a machinist. He came to this range once every few months, always signing in as a visitor and always shooting by himself. The staff knew him as a quiet old man who never caused trouble and always cleaned up after himself. At the visitor desk, Henry signed his name in the logbook just as he had done dozens of times before. Lisa Grant glanced at the signature but was busy preparing for the SEAL training session. She had seen Henry before and knew he was harmless. Just another old veteran who liked to shoot his antique rifle at the shorter ranges. She handed him a pair of safety glasses and hearing protection, reminding him to stay in the designated visitor area unless he was called to the firing line. Henry found a seat in the observation area where visitors could watch the military training. From here, he could see the entire range and observe the techniques that the young soldiers used. He set his rifle case on the ground beside his chair and folded his hands in his lap, watching with eyes that missed nothing. These SEALs were impressive, he could see that right away. Their equipment was far beyond anything he had used during his own military service, and their physical conditioning was obvious from the way they moved and carried themselves. But as Henry watched them prepare for shooting, he noticed small things that the men themselves might not have realized. He saw how some of them gripped their rifles too tightly, creating tension that would affect their accuracy. He observed breathing patterns that were not quite right, and shooting positions that looked correct but could be improved. These observations came from decades of experience, and a natural ability that had been honed by necessity during a war where missing a target could mean death. The SEALs continued their preparations, unaware that they were being studied by someone who understood shooting in ways that their modern training had not taught them. Henry sat quietly, appearing to be just another curious visitor who wanted to watch military training. He had no intention of interfering with their session or drawing attention to himself. He was content to observe and perhaps learn something about how the military trained its soldiers in the modern era. Commander Morrison called his men to attention and began giving instructions for the day's competition. The first event would be precision shooting at 100 meters, followed by longer distances as the day progressed. Each man would fire 10 shots at each distance, and the combined scores would determine the winner. The SEALs took their positions on the firing line, confident in their abilities and eager to prove themselves against their teammates. Henry settled back in his chair and prepared to watch some of the finest military marksmen in the world demonstrate their skills. The sound of rifle fire echoed across the range as the SEALs began their competition. Nick Carter fired his first shot and watched through his scope as the bullet struck the target just slightly left of center, earning him a 9 instead of the perfect 10 he wanted. He adjusted his aim and fired again, this time hitting closer to the bullseye. The electronic scoring system displayed each shot immediately, and the other SEALs could see how their teammates were performing in real time. Alex Turner was having a good day, putting together a string of 10s and 9s that kept him competitive with Nick. His breathing was steady, and his trigger control was smooth, two fundamentals that his instructors had drilled into him during months of training. Alex had grown up in Montana where his father had taught him to hunt, so he understood rifles and shooting better than some of his teammates who had learned everything in the military. Still, he knew that military precision shooting was different from hunting, requiring a level of consistency that few civilian shooters ever achieved. Paul Davis fired his 10 shots quickly, confident in his abilities but perhaps rushing slightly in his eagerness to post a good score. His grouping was tight but not quite centered, giving him a respectable score that put him in third place after the first distance. Paul looked at his target through binoculars and shook his head, knowing he could do better. He had been shooting since he was 12 years old and prided himself on his marksmanship, but today the rifle felt slightly off, though he could not identify exactly what was wrong. Lieutenant Scott Williams took his time, firing each shot with deliberate care. As the team leader, he felt pressure to set a good example, and his score reflected his methodical approach. Scott had learned during his combat deployments that patience and consistency mattered more than speed when lives were on the line. His target showed a neat cluster of holes near the center, earning him second place behind Nick Carter after the first stage of the competition. During the break between distances, the SEALs gathered around a table to drink water and discuss their performance. The California sun was getting higher, and the heat was beginning to affect everyone, making hydration important for maintaining concentration. Paul Davis wiped sweat from his forehead and made a comment that carried across the range area about civilian shooters who thought they understood military precision. He spoke loudly enough for others to hear, partly from habit and partly because he enjoyed being the center of attention when he told stories or made observations about shooting. Henry Walsh heard the comment from his seat in the visitor area but showed no reaction beyond a slight smile that creased the corners of his eyes. He had heard similar comments many times over the years from younger men who had never experienced combat or learned to shoot under conditions where accuracy meant survival. Henry understood their confidence and did not take offense at their words, knowing that confidence was important for soldiers who might face danger in their missions. Lisa Grant noticed Henry's expression and walked over to where he sat. She had been watching him observe the SEAL training with obvious interest and experience, noting how his eyes followed each shooter and seemed to analyze their techniques. Lisa had been around military personnel long enough to recognize someone who understood firearms and shooting, even when that person was not in uniform or actively participating. She asked Henry if he would like a closer look at the equipment that the SEALs were using, thinking that he might enjoy seeing the advanced rifles and scopes that represented the latest military technology. Henry thanked her for the offer and stood up slowly, his movements careful but not frail. As they walked toward the equipment area, Henry asked polite questions about the rifles and their capabilities, showing knowledge that surprised Lisa with its depth and accuracy. The SEALs were preparing for the next stage of their competition when Henry approached with Lisa. He looked at the advanced rifles with appreciation, noting the quality of the scopes and the precision of the manufacturing. When Lisa introduced him to Commander Morrison as a visitor who was interested in the training, Henry shook hands with the officer and complimented the performance he had observed so far. Commander Morrison was polite but focused on his men and their training schedule. He explained briefly how the competition worked and what standards the SEALs were expected to meet in their marksmanship qualifications. Henry listened respectfully and asked a few questions that showed he understood military training, requirements, and the importance of accurate shooting for special operations personnel. After a few minutes of conversation, Henry hesitated slightly and then spoke quietly to Commander Morrison. He said that he was wondering if there might be room for one more shooter in the day's activities, explaining that he had brought his own rifle and would be grateful for the opportunity to shoot on such a well-maintained range. His request was polite and humble, with no suggestion that he expected special treatment or consideration. The SEALs who were nearby heard Henry's request and exchanged glances that showed their amusement at the idea of an elderly civilian joining their competition. Nick Carter whispered something to Alex Turner that made both men smile, though they tried to hide their reaction out of respect for the old man. Paul Davis was less subtle, letting out a small chuckle and shaking his head at what he saw as an entertaining development in their training day. Commander Morrison considered the request for a moment, weighing military regulations against common courtesy and the public relations value of allowing a veteran to participate in a small way. The range was not classified, and the training was routine marksmanship practice rather than sensitive tactical exercises. After checking with Lisa Grant about insurance and safety requirements, he agreed to let Henry take a few shots at the shorter distances. Henry thanked the commander and walked back to retrieve his rifle case from the visitor area. The SEALs continued their preparations while making quiet comments about what they expected from the civilian shooter. Most of them assumed that Henry was probably a decent shot by civilian standards, but would struggle to match military precision and consistency. They had seen many police officers and competitive shooters visit the range over the years, and while some were quite good, none had approached the level of skill that special operations personnel maintained. When Henry returned with his leather case, the SEALs gathered around with curiosity to see what kind of rifle an elderly civilian would bring to a military range. Henry set the case on a table and opened it carefully, revealing the M1 Garand that had been his companion for over 50 years. The rifle was obviously old, but appeared to be in excellent condition, with metal surfaces that showed careful maintenance and wood furniture that had been properly preserved. The reaction from the SEALs was immediate and unmistakable. Alex Turner looked at Nick Carter with raised eyebrows, while Paul Davis made another comment about antique weapons and their place in modern shooting. The M1 Garand had been obsolete for decades, replaced by more advanced rifles that offered better accuracy and reliability. To the young SEALs, Henry's rifle looked like something that belonged in a museum rather than on a precision shooting range. Lieutenant Scott Williams examined the rifle more carefully than his teammates, noting the quality of its construction and the obvious care that had been taken in its maintenance. Scott had some knowledge of military history and recognized the M1 Garand as the primary American infantry weapon of World War II and Korea. He asked Henry about the rifle's history and was told that it had been well cared for but was original military issue from many years ago, Commander. Morrison checked his watch and announced that they would let Henry shoot a few rounds at the 100-meter targets before continuing with the SEAL competition. He explained the range safety rules and confirmed that Henry understood the commands that Lisa Grant would use to control the firing line. Henry nodded his understanding and began preparing his rifle for shooting, his movements showing familiarity and confidence that suggested extensive experience with the weapon. The SEALs positioned themselves where they could observe Henry's shooting through spotting scopes and binoculars. They expected to see respectable shooting from an older man who probably had military experience, but they also expected to confirm their assumption that modern equipment and training produced superior results. Nick Carter adjusted his spotting scope and prepared to call out Henry's shots as they impacted the target. Henry approached the firing line with his M1 Garand, moving with deliberate steps that showed no hesitation or uncertainty. He had shot on ranges like this many times before, though usually without an audience of elite military personnel watching his every move. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, like an old friend that he could trust completely. Henry knew this weapon's capabilities and limitations better than most people knew their own automobiles. As he took his position on the firing line, Henry showed no signs of nervousness or concern about performing in front of the SEALs. His stance was natural and comfortable, developed through decades of practice and refined by experience that the younger men could not imagine. Henry loaded 8 rounds into the rifle's internal magazine, the distinctive ping of the clip being inserted, bringing back memories of ranges and battlefields from low. Henry settled into his shooting position, with movements that seemed almost mechanical in their precision and economy. He placed his left elbow on the ground at exactly the right angle, created a stable platform with his body, and brought the rifle up to his shoulder in one smooth motion. The M1 Garand nestled against his shoulder like it belonged there, and his cheek found its natural place on the wooden stock without any fumbling or adjustment. The iron sights aligned perfectly with his eye, and Henry's breathing settled into the slow, controlled rhythm that he had learned more than 50 years ago. The SEALs watched through their spotting scopes and binoculars, expecting to see the careful but ultimately limited performance of an elderly civilian shooter. Nick Carter had his scope focused on the 100-meter target, ready to call out where Henry's shots would land. Alex Turner stood beside him, also watching with interest but without much expectation of seeing anything remarkable. Paul Davis continued to make quiet comments about the old rifle and its limitations compared to modern precision weapons. Commander Morrison observed from behind the firing line, his attention split between Henry's shooting and his responsibility for range safety. Lisa Grant stood at her position with the range controls, ready to call a ceasefire if anything went wrong. Lieutenant Scott Williams watched with more interest than his teammates, partly because of his respect for military history, and partly because something about Henry's demeanor suggested that the old man knew exactly what he was doing. Henry's first shot broke the morning silence, with the distinctive crack of the M1 Garand. The sound was different from the modern rifles that the SEALs used, sharper and somehow more authoritative. The muzzle flash was brief, and the rifle's action cycled smoothly, ejecting the empty brass case and loading the next round from the 8-round clip. Henry remained motionless except for working the operating handle, his position unchanged and his breathing steady. Nick Carter stared through his spotting scope at the target downrange, blinking several times to make sure he was seeing correctly. The electronic scoring system displayed a perfect 10, indicating that the bullet had struck dead center in the bullseye. Nick called out the score in a voice that carried a note of surprise, though he tried to hide his reaction. A perfect shot at 100 meters was not unusual for military marksmen, but it was impressive for an elderly civilian using iron sights on an old rifle. Henry fired his second shot without changing position or taking extra time to aim. The rifle cracked again and another empty case flew out to land in the grass beside the firing point. This time Nick Carter did not need to look long through his spotting scope before calling out another 10. The second bullet had struck so close to the first that it was difficult to see 2 separate holes in the target. Alex Turner asked to look through the scope and confirmed that both shots appeared to have hit in almost exactly the same place. The third shot followed quickly, and then the fourth and fifth. Each shot produced the same result, a perfect 10 with the bullet striking within millimeters of the previous shots. The electronic scoring system registered each impact and calculated the growing score, but more importantly, the spotting scopes showed a group of bullet holes that was smaller than most shooters could achieve with the finest modern equipment. Henry's breathing remained steady, and his position never varied, as if he were a machine designed specifically for accurate shooting. Paul Davis stopped making comments about old rifles and civilian shooters. He stood behind his own spotting scope, watching in disbelief as Henry continued to place shots in what appeared to be the same hole. The grouping was so tight that it challenged the ability of the optical equipment to distinguish individual bullet impacts. Paul had been shooting for 20 years, and had never seen anything like what he was witnessing from the old man with the ancient rifle. Henry fired his sixth shot, then his seventh, maintaining the same mechanical rhythm that had characterized all his shooting. His trigger control was perfect, with each shot breaking at exactly the right moment in his breathing cycle. The rifle's recoil seemed to have no effect on his position, as if he were absorbing the energy and returning immediately to perfect alignment with the target. The empty brass cases piled up beside him, bright and shiny against the dark soil of the firing point. Lieutenant Scott Williams borrowed binoculars from one of his men and studied Henry's technique more carefully. He noticed that the old man's breathing pattern was different from what they taught in modern military schools, longer and more deliberate, but somehow more natural. Henry's grip on the rifle was firm but not tense, and his trigger finger moved with the kind of precision that came only from thousands of hours of practice. Scott began to realize that they were watching something special, though he could not yet understand the full implications of what he was seeing. The eighth and final shot from Henry's clip rang out across the range, followed by the distinctive ping sound that the M1 Garand made when its empty clip was ejected. Henry remained in position for a few seconds longer, then slowly lowered his rifle and sat back on his heels. He showed no signs of excitement or satisfaction, behaving as if what he had just done was routine and expected rather than remarkable. Nick Carter stared at the target display screen, which showed 8 perfect 10s with a group measurement that was smaller than most competitive shooters achieved, with unlimited time and the finest equipment available. The mathematical center of the group was exactly in the bullseye, with individual shots scattered around that center point by margins measured in millimeters rather than inches. The combined group could be covered by a quarter, and possibly by a dime. Commander Morrison walked over to examine the electronic scoring system personally, wanting to verify what his men were reporting. The display showed not only the individual shot scores but also calculated statistics about group size and consistency that confirmed what the spotting scopes had revealed. Henry had just shot a perfect score with a grouping that would be considered exceptional even for Olympic-level competitive shooters using the most advanced equipment available. Alex Turner asked Lisa Grant to double-check the target systems to make sure they were functioning properly. Lisa ran a quick diagnostic that confirmed all equipment was working within normal parameters. The scores and measurements were accurate, which meant that what they had witnessed was real, rather than some kind of equipment malfunction or optical illusion. Henry began cleaning his rifle with a small kit that he produced from his pocket. His movements were careful and methodical, showing the same attention to detail that had characterized his shooting. He swabbed the barrel, wiped down the metal surfaces, and checked the action to ensure that everything was functioning properly. The rifle maintenance was obviously a habit developed over decades of use, performed automatically regardless of how many rounds had been fired. Paul Davis approached Henry with a mixture of respect and curiosity, asking where he had learned to shoot with such precision. Henry looked up from his rifle cleaning and replied quietly that he had practiced quite a bit over the years. Nothing more specific than that. His tone was modest and matter-of-fact, showing neither pride in his performance nor surprise at the reaction it had generated from the professional military marksman. The SEALs gathered around the scoring display, studying the numbers and trying to understand what they had just witnessed. These men were accustomed to excellent shooting and high standards, but Henry's performance exceeded anything in their experience. The combination of perfect accuracy and incredible consistency using iron sights and an old rifle challenged their assumptions about modern equipment and training methods. Nick Carter asked, Henry about his rifle, wanting to know more about the weapon that had just outperformed their state-of-the-art precision instruments. Henry explained that it was a standard M1 Garand that he had maintained carefully over the years, with no modifications or special features beyond good cleaning and proper storage. The rifle was exactly what it appeared to be. A military weapon from World War II that had been kept in excellent condition through decades of care and regular use. Lieutenant Scott Williams studied Henry's position and technique, trying to identify what made his shooting so different from their own. He noticed subtle details in the way Henry held the rifle and controlled his breathing, small differences that might not seem important, but apparently contributed to extraordinary accuracy. Scott realized that they were in the presence of someone who had mastered fundamentals that their modern training had perhaps overlooked or simplified. Commander Morrison checked his watch and considered the training schedule for the day. The SEAL competition was supposed to continue with longer distances, but Henry's demonstration had created a situation that required some thought. The scores that Henry had just posted would stand as a range record, surpassing marks set by Olympic shooters and military champions who had used every advantage that modern technology could provide. Henry finished cleaning his rifle and closed his kit, preparing to return to the visitor area and allow the SEALs to continue their training. He had accomplished what he came to do, which was simply to shoot a few rounds and enjoy the use of a well-maintained range. Commander Morrison stepped forward as Henry prepared to leave the firing line, his mind working through the implications of what he had just witnessed. As an officer responsible for training some of the military's finest marksmen, Morrison understood that he was looking at a level of shooting skill that his men had never encountered. The old man with the ancient rifle had just demonstrated accuracy that exceeded their best equipment and training, using nothing but iron sights and fundamentals that seemed to come from another era of warfare. Morrison cleared his throat and spoke directly to Henry, his voice carrying the respect that one professional gives to another. He suggested that if Henry was willing and had the time, perhaps they could try some shooting at longer distances to see how the M1 Garand performed compared to their modern precision rifles. Morrison framed the suggestion as a learning opportunity for his men, but truthfully he was as curious as anyone to see whether Henry's performance at 100 meters could be repeated at more challenging ranges. Henry looked up from packing his cleaning kit and considered the offer for a moment. He had not planned to spend the entire day at the range, but the respectful way that Morrison had made the request and the obvious interest of the SEALs made him willing to continue. Henry nodded his agreement and asked what distance the commander had in mind, his tone suggesting that he was prepared for whatever challenge they might propose. Morrison consulted with Lieutenant Scott Williams and decided to move directly to the 300-meter targets, skipping the intermediate distances that would normally be used in a progression. At 300 meters, even skilled military marksmen began to see the effects of wind, equipment limitations, and human error that made perfect scores difficult to achieve. Morrison was curious to see whether Henry's remarkable consistency would continue. When the shooting became more demanding, the SEALs moved their equipment to the 300-meter firing points while Henry walked alongside them, carrying his rifle and a small box of ammunition that appeared to be as old as the weapon itself. Nick Carter asked about the ammunition, and Henry explained that he loaded his own cartridges using techniques and components that had proven reliable over many years of shooting. The bullets were standard military specification, but Henry had developed his own loading procedures that maximized consistency and accuracy. Alex Turner helped set up the spotting scopes at the new distance while Paul Davis prepared the electronic scoring systems for the longer range. At 300 meters, the targets appeared much smaller through the scopes, and wind conditions became a significant factor in bullet placement. A gentle breeze was blowing across the range from left to right, not strong enough to bother most shooters, but sufficient to push bullets slightly off course if not properly compensated. Henry studied the wind flags that were positioned at intervals along the range, noting their direction and intensity with eyes that had learned to read environmental conditions under much more difficult circumstances. He made small adjustments to his rifle's rear sight, turning the windage knob with fingers that knew exactly how much correction was needed for the observed conditions. The sight adjustments were minimal, suggesting that Henry had extensive experience shooting at this distance and understood his rifle's ballistics perfectly. Lieutenant Scott Williams watched Henry's preparation routine with growing interest, noting how the old man seemed to gather information about range conditions through methods that were not taught in modern military schools. Henry looked at the grass near the targets, observed the movement of leaves on distant trees, and even seemed to test the air temperature and humidity in ways that suggested decades of experience reading environmental factors that affected bullet flight. The SEALs took positions behind their spotting scopes, expecting to see good shooting, but also anticipating that the longer distance would reveal the limitations of iron sights and old equipment. Nick Carter focused his scope on the 300-meter target, while Alex Turner prepared to time Henry's shots and note his shooting rhythm. Paul Davis positioned himself where he could observe Henry's technique and compare it to the methods they had learned in their military training. Commander Morrison gave Henry permission to begin shooting when ready, and Rangemaster Lisa Grant called the line hot for the longer distance engagement. Henry settled into his firing position with the same deliberate movements he had used at 100 meters. But this time he spent several additional seconds studying the target and making final adjustments to his position and sight picture. The 300-meter distance required more precision in every aspect of shooting, from breathing control to trigger manipulation. Henry's first shot at 300 meters rang out across the range with the same authoritative crack of the M1 Garand. The bullet's flight time to the target was noticeably longer than at the shorter distance, giving everyone a moment to anticipate the result. Nick Carter watched through his spotting scope as the bullet struck the target, then announced another perfect 10 with a tone of voice that reflected his growing amazement at Henry's consistency. The second shot followed after Henry had taken time to read the wind conditions again and make a slight adjustment to his aiming point. This shot also struck the bullseye, landing close enough to the first impact that the two holes began to merge into a single larger opening in the target paper. Alex Turner confirmed the second 10 and began to realize that they were witnessing something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about marksmanship and equipment limitations. Henry continued his methodical shooting, firing 8 rounds in total with the same careful attention to fundamentals that had characterized his performance at the shorter distance. Each shot was preceded by a brief study of wind conditions and a moment of absolute stillness before the trigger broke. The M1 Garand's distinctive sound punctuated the morning air as empty brass cases accumulated beside the firing point, each one representing another perfect hit on a target that most shooters would consider challenging. Even with modern scopes, Paul Davis found himself unable to make his usual comments about civilian shooting or old equipment. The target display showed a string of perfect 10s with a group size that rivaled anything the SEALs had ever achieved with their precision rifles and advanced optics. The mathematical center of Henry's group was exactly in the bullseye, with individual shots distributed around that center in a pattern that suggested machine-like consistency rather than human performance. Lieutenant Scott Williams borrowed different binoculars to study Henry's shooting position and technique more carefully. He noticed that Henry's body position was slightly different at 300 meters, with small adjustments to his stance and rifle hold that compensated for the longer distance and environmental factors. These adjustments appeared to be automatic and intuitive, rather than the result of conscious calculation, suggesting experience that had become instinctive through years of practice. Commander Morrison watched the electronic scoring system display Henry's accumulating score with a mixture of professional admiration and growing curiosity about the old man's background. Perfect scores at 300 meters with iron sights were rare, even among Olympic-level competitive shooters, and Henry was achieving this performance with equipment that predated most of the observers by decades. Morrison began to suspect that Henry's military service had involved more than routine infantry duty. Alex Turner asked Lisa Grant to verify the target systems again, wanting to ensure that the remarkable scores were accurate rather than the result of equipment malfunction. Lisa ran another diagnostic sequence that confirmed all systems were functioning normally, and that the displayed scores reflected actual bullet impacts on the targets. The measurements were real, which meant that Henry's shooting was genuinely as extraordinary as it appeared. Henry fired his final shot at 300 meters and listened for the characteristic ping as the empty clip ejected from his rifle. He remained in position for a few seconds longer than necessary, then slowly lowered the weapon and began the process of reloading for another string of fire. His movements showed no signs of fatigue or stress, and his expression remained calm and focused, as if shooting perfect scores at long range was a routine activity rather than an exceptional demonstration of skill. Nick Carter called out the final score in group measurement, confirming that Henry had once again shot a perfect score with a grouping that could be covered by a small coin. The consistency of his performance across two very different distances suggested that his shooting ability was not limited to specific ranges or conditions, but represented a fundamental mastery of marksmanship that transcended the limitations of equipment or environmental factors. The SEALs gathered around their spotting scopes and scoring displays, trying to process what they had witnessed and understand its implications for their own training and assumptions about shooting. These men were accustomed to being the best at everything they did, but Henry had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded their own performance by margins that could not be explained by luck or favorable conditions. Commander Morrison made a decision that would extend the day's training in directions that none of them had anticipated. When they arrived at the range, the Commander Morrison looked at the scores from the 300-meter shooting and made a decision that surprised even himself. He approached Henry, who was cleaning his rifle again with the same methodical care he had shown after every string of fire. Morrison asked if Henry would be willing to try shooting at 600 meters, a distance where even the most skilled military marksmen began to struggle with consistency and accuracy. At 600 meters, environmental factors became critical, and the limitations of equipment and human ability were pushed to their limits. Henry paused in his rifle cleaning and looked downrange toward the 600-meter targets, which appeared as small dots even through high-powered spotting scopes. He had shot at this distance many times before, but never with an audience of elite military personnel watching his every move. After considering for a moment, Henry nodded his agreement and asked about the wind conditions and target specifications at the longer range. Lieutenant Scott Williams explained that the 600-meter targets were standard military precision targets with scoring rings that required extreme accuracy to hit consistently. At this distance, a bullet drop of several feet had to be compensated for, and crosswinds that seemed gentle at the firing line could push bullets inches off course by the time they reached the target. Even with the finest modern rifles and scopes, maintaining consistency at 600 meters required exceptional skill and perfect conditions. The SEALs moved their equipment to the 600-meter firing points, a process that took several minutes and allowed them to discuss among themselves what they expected to see from Henry's shooting at the extended range. Nick Carter expressed doubt that iron sights could provide sufficient precision for accurate shooting at 600 meters, while Alex Turner wondered whether the old ammunition that Henry used would maintain its velocity and accuracy. Over the longer distance, Paul Davis had stopped making jokes about civilian shooters and old equipment, but he still believed that modern technology would eventually prove superior to whatever skills Henry possessed. At 600 meters, the advantages of computerized scopes, precision manufactured ammunition, and state-of-the-art rifles should overcome any human factors that had allowed Henry to succeed at shorter distances. Paul prepared his spotting scope and settled in to watch what he expected would be the first demonstration of Henry's limitations. Henry studied the range conditions more carefully than he had at the shorter distances, spending several minutes observing wind flags, noting changes in air temperature as clouds passed over the sun, and even testing the consistency of his rifle's operation by working the action several times. He made more significant adjustments to his rear sight, compensating for the increased bullet drop and the different wind conditions that existed at various points along the bullet's flight path. The wind at 600 meters was more complex than at shorter ranges, with different velocities and directions at different distances from the firing line. Henry watched the grass near the targets move differently than the flags at the 200-meter mark, indicating wind patterns that would require careful reading and precise compensation. He had learned to shoot in conditions far more challenging than these, but the presence of observers made him want to ensure that his performance reflected his true capabilities. Commander Morrison positioned himself where he could observe both Henry's shooting technique and the target displays that would show the results of each shot. At 600 meters, even small errors in fundamentals would be magnified into significant misses, and Morrison was curious to see whether Henry's remarkable consistency would continue under more demanding conditions. The commander had seen many expert shooters struggle at this distance, even with every advantage that modern equipment could provide. Rangemaster Lisa Grant made sure that all safety protocols were followed for the longer distance shooting, checking that the range was clear and that all personnel were in safe positions. At 600 meters, the sound of the bullet impact on the target was delayed noticeably after the sound of the shot, creating an additional challenge for spotters trying to follow the trajectory and call hits. Lisa positioned herself where she could observe the entire range and ensure that safety procedures were maintained throughout the extended shooting session. Henry settled into his firing position with even more deliberate care than he had shown at shorter distances. His body position was adjusted to accommodate the steep angle required for the 600-meter shot, and he spent additional time ensuring that his natural point of aim was exactly correct. The margin for error at this distance was much smaller than at 300 meters, requiring perfect consistency in every aspect of shooting technique. The first shot at 600 meters seemed to hang in the air longer than the previous shots, giving everyone time to anticipate the result. The crack of the M1 Garand was followed by several seconds of silence before Nick Carter announced through his spotting scope that he could see a hit in the bullseye area. The electronic scoring system confirmed a 10, though the group measurement statistics would not be meaningful until several shots had been fired to establish a pattern. Henry's second shot at 600 meters required additional wind reading, as the breeze had shifted slightly during the time between shots. He made a minute adjustment to his aiming point and fired again, producing another impact that Nick Carter called as very close to the first shot. The electronic display showed another perfect 10, with a group measurement that was beginning to establish Henry's consistency at the challenging distance. Alex Turner watched Henry's shooting rhythm and noticed that the old man was taking more time between shots at 600 meters, not from uncertainty, but from the need to read conditions more carefully and ensure that each shot was fired under optimal circumstances. The environmental factors that could be ignored at shorter distances became critical at 600 meters, requiring patience and experience to manage successfully. Paul Davis observed Henry's technique through binoculars, noting details of position and rifle handling that were different from the methods taught in modern military shooting schools. Henry's breathing pattern was longer and more deliberate. His trigger control was smoother than what Paul had been taught, and his follow-through after each shot was more complete. These differences appeared to contribute to consistency rather than detract from it, challenging Paul's assumptions about proper shooting technique. Henry continued firing his string of 10 shots at 600 meters, maintaining the same methodical approach that had characterized his shooting at shorter distances. Each shot was preceded by careful observation of conditions and precise adjustment of his position or aiming point to compensate for environmental factors. The sound of empty brass cases hitting the ground provided a rhythm that matched Henry's steady breathing and deliberate shot timing. Lieutenant Scott Williams studied the accumulating target display and realized that Henry was once again shooting a perfect score despite the challenging conditions and extended range. The group size was larger than at shorter distances, but it remained remarkably tight for 600-meter shooting with iron sights. Scott began to understand that they were witnessing shooting skills that represented a different era of marksmanship training, when soldiers learned to shoot under field conditions without the support of modern technology. Commander Morrison calculated the mathematical probability of Henry's performance and realized that the consistency being demonstrated was beyond what could be explained by chance or favorable conditions. The perfect scores at multiple distances with such tight groupings indicated a level of shooting mastery that Morrison had never encountered in his military career. The implications for training and equipment philosophy were significant and would require considerable thought to fully understand. Henry fired his final shot at 600 meters and listened for the ping of the ejecting clip that signaled the completion of his ammunition. He remained in position briefly, then slowly lowered his rifle and began the familiar process of cleaning and inspection that followed every shooting session. His expression remained calm and focused, showing neither satisfaction with his performance nor surprise at the reaction it was generating from the professional military observers. Nick Carter announced the final score and group measurements for the 600-meter shooting. confirming that Henry had achieved another perfect score with grouping that would be considered exceptional, even for competitive shooters using the finest modern equipment. The consistency across 3 different distances with increasingly challenging conditions demonstrated shooting ability that transcended normal human limitations and suggested experience that the SEALs were beginning to recognize as extraordinary. The range fell silent except for the sound of Henry cleaning his rifle and the distant flutter of wind flags that had provided the environmental challenges for his remarkable demonstration of marksmanship skill. The silence that followed Henry's final shot at 600 meters was broken by Lieutenant Scott Williams, who approached the old man with genuine curiosity and growing respect. Scott had been thinking about Henry's shooting technique and the subtle differences he had observed compared to modern military training methods. Something about Henry's approach suggested experience that went far beyond recreational shooting or even competitive marksmanship. Scott asked politely about Henry's background, wondering if he might have military experience that could explain his extraordinary shooting abilities. Henry finished cleaning his rifle before responding, taking his time to ensure that every component was properly maintained, despite having fired only a few dozen rounds. When he finally looked up at Scott, Henry's expression was thoughtful and somewhat reserved, as if he were considering how much information to share with these young military men. After a moment, Henry replied quietly that he had spent some time in the service many years ago, though he did not elaborate on the details of his military career or the circumstances that had led to his shooting skills. Scott pressed gently for more information, explaining that he and his teammates were fascinated by Henry's technique and wondered where he had learned to shoot with such precision. Henry seemed to consider the question carefully before admitting that he had served as a Marine during the Vietnam War, adding almost as an afterthought that he had been assigned to duties that required accurate shooting under difficult conditions. His tone was matter-of-fact and understated, showing none of the pride or boastfulness that might be expected from someone who had just demonstrated exceptional skills. The mention of Vietnam and Marine service caused an immediate change in the atmosphere among the SEALs. These men understood military history and recognized that Vietnam-era Marines had faced combat conditions that tested every aspect of their training and abilities. Nick Carter asked what Henry's specific duties had been during his service, and Henry replied simply that he had been a scout sniper, spending most of his deployment in forward positions where accurate shooting was essential for survival and mission success. Commander Morrison heard this revelation and moved closer to join the conversation, his interest now intensified by the understanding that Henry was not simply a civilian shooter, but a combat veteran with specialized training in precision marksmanship. Morrison knew that Vietnam-era snipers had operated under conditions that modern military personnel could barely imagine, using basic equipment and relying entirely on fundamental skills that had been honed through necessity and constant danger. Paul Davis, who had earlier made comments about civilian shooters, found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about marksmanship and military history. Vietnam War snipers were legendary figures in military circles, men who had achieved impossible shots under combat conditions with equipment that was primitive by current standards. Paul realized that he had been watching a demonstration by someone whose shooting experience included situations where missing meant death for himself and his fellow Marines. Alex Turner asked Henry about his rifle and whether it was the same weapon he had used during his military service. Henry explained that his current M1 Garand was not his original service rifle, which had been a different model, but that he had acquired this particular weapon after the war and had maintained it carefully for over 50 years. He had learned to shoot with iron sights and basic equipment because that was all that was available to snipers during his era of service, long before the development of advanced optics and computerized systems. Henry began to share some details about his military experience, though he spoke in the understated manner typical of combat veterans discussing their service. He mentioned shooting at distances that made the day's demonstration seem routine, often under conditions that included rain, wind, poor visibility, and the stress of enemy contact. Henry described having to make first-round hits at extended ranges because second shots were rarely possible when the enemy knew a sniper was present. Lieutenant Scott Williams listened with growing amazement. As Henry casually mentioned, shooting at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters with iron sights, often from improvised positions in jungle environments where stable shooting platforms were impossible to construct. These shots had been made not for competition or training, but as part of combat operations where accuracy meant the difference between mission success and failure, between returning home and becoming a casualty statistic. The SEALs began to understand that Henry's shooting demonstration represented skills that had been developed and proven under the ultimate test of combat conditions. Modern military snipers used sophisticated equipment that provided advantages Henry's generation never had. But Henry's fundamental abilities had been forged in circumstances where equipment failure meant relying entirely on personal skill and experience. The comparison between their high-tech approach and Henry's basic techniques was revealing aspects of marksmanship that their training had never addressed. "Commander," Morrison asked about Henry's longest confirmed shot during his military service, and Henry mentioned distances that seemed almost impossible, given the equipment available during the Vietnam era. He spoke of shots made across valleys and rice paddies, through vegetation and in weather conditions that would challenge modern snipers with every technological advantage. Henry's tone remained matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing routine activities rather than extraordinary feats of marksmanship. Nick Carter realized that he was talking to someone who represented a link to military history, a man whose shooting experience included situations that modern soldiers learned about in books, but had never faced personally. The confidence that Nick had felt in his own abilities and equipment was now tempered by the understanding that fundamental skills mattered more than technology, and that Henry possessed those fundamentals at a level that years of modern training had not achieved. Paul Davis asked Henry about his shooting training during military service, curious to learn how Vietnam-era snipers developed their skills without the benefit of formal sniper schools and structured programs that existed in the modern military. Henry explained that his training had been largely informal, learning from older Marines who had combat experience and practicing constantly under field conditions that simulated the environments where his skills would be tested. Alex Turner inquired about the differences between Henry's era of sniper work and modern precision shooting, prompting Henry to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of technological progress. Henry acknowledged that modern equipment provided capabilities that his generation could never have imagined, but he also noted that reliance on technology could create vulnerabilities when equipment failed or was not available. His own skills had been developed to function regardless of equipment limitations or environmental conditions. Henry's stories about Vietnam revealed shooting challenges that the SEALs had never considered, situations where snipers had to engage targets while hanging from ropes, shooting through small openings in dense vegetation, or making shots while being moved by helicopter or boat. These unconventional shooting positions required adaptability and fundamental skills that could not be programmed into computerized equipment or learned through standardized training programs. Lieutenant Scott Williams began to appreciate the depth of experience that Henry represented and the value of learning from someone who had mastered marksmanship under conditions that tested every aspect of human ability. The techniques that Henry used seemed simple compared to modern methods, but their effectiveness was undeniable and their applicability was broader than the specialized approaches taught in contemporary military schools. Commander Morrison recognized that the day's training had evolved into something more valuable than a standard marksmanship competition. His men were receiving education from a master practitioner whose experience spanned decades and included situations that would challenge their understanding of what was possible. With basic equipment and fundamental skills, Morrison decided to extend the training session to take full advantage of this unexpected opportunity for his team to learn from a living piece of military history. The revelation of Henry's background transformed the SEALs' perception of the old man from amusing civilian shooter to respected combat veteran whose demonstrated abilities represented the highest levels of military marksmanship achievement. Commander Morrison walked over to the range office where Lisa Grant kept the official records for the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. The commander wanted to verify what he suspected about Henry's shooting performance and its place in the facility's history. Lisa pulled out a thick logbook that contained decades of shooting records, including scores from visiting Olympic athletes, military champions, and competitive shooters who had used the range over the years. The pages were filled with impressive scores and notable achievements, representing the finest marksmanship demonstrations that the facility had ever witnessed. Morrison and Lisa worked through the calculations, combining Henry's scores from all three distances and comparing them to the existing records. The mathematics were straightforward, but the results were remarkable. Henry's combined score exceeded every previous record by margins that seemed almost impossible. The previous record holder had been an Olympic shooter who visited the range 2 years earlier, using a custom-built rifle worth more than most automobiles and ammunition that cost several dollars per round. Lisa double-checked her calculations and confirmed that Henry's performance with his World War II-era rifle and homemade ammunition had surpassed the Olympic shooter's record by nearly 15%. More significantly, Henry's group measurements at each distance were smaller than anything in the record books, demonstrating consistency that challenged the mathematical limits of what should be possible with iron sights and basic equipment. The SEALs gathered around the record book as Morrison announced Henry's achievement, studying the numbers and trying to process the implications of what they had witnessed. Nick Carter looked at his own best scores in the record book and realized that Henry had exceeded them by margins that represented years of training and improvement. Alex Turner calculated that Henry's worst single shot of the day would have been among the best shots that most military marksmen ever achieved in their careers. Paul Davis studied the equipment specifications that were recorded alongside the various records, noting the progression from basic military rifles to increasingly sophisticated precision instruments that had been used by record holders over the decades. Henry's achievement stood out not only for its numerical superiority, but also for the stark contrast between his equipment and the high-tech weapons used by other record holders. The old M1 Garand seemed almost primitive compared to the computerized rifles that filled the equipment. List Lieutenant Scott Williams asked Lisa Grant about the procedures for officially recording Henry's achievement, wanting to ensure that the remarkable performance would be properly documented for future reference. Lisa explained that all scores were automatically recorded by the electronic systems, and that Henry's achievement would be entered in the permanent records as soon as the paperwork was completed. The record would include not only the scores, but also details about the rifle and ammunition used, creating a historical document that future shooters would find difficult to believe. Henry listened to the discussion about records and recognition with apparent indifference, more concerned with ensuring that his rifle was properly cleaned and stored than with the significance that others attached to his shooting. When Commander Morrison congratulated him on breaking records that had stood for years, Henry responded modestly that he had simply enjoyed the opportunity to shoot on such a well-maintained range. His lack of excitement about the achievement only added to the respect that the SEALs felt for his character and abilities. Commander Morrison made a decision that reflected both his appreciation for Henry's demonstration and his recognition of the learning opportunity that had presented itself. He asked Henry if he would be willing to spend some time coaching his men, sharing techniques and insights that might help them improve their own shooting. Morrison explained that the SEALs were always looking for ways to enhance their skills, and Henry's approach clearly offered lessons that their standard training had not provided. Henry considered the request thoughtfully, looking at the faces of the young SEALs who had watched his demonstration with growing respect and curiosity. After a moment, he agreed to spend an hour working with them, though he cautioned that his methods were quite different from modern military training and might not translate easily to their equipment and procedures. Henry's willingness to share his knowledge reflected the same generosity that had characterized his entire interaction with the military personnel. The coaching session began with Henry observing each SEAL's shooting position and technique, noting details that they themselves were not aware of, and identifying areas where small improvements could yield significant results. Henry's approach was gentle but direct, focusing on fundamental principles rather than complex technical adjustments. He emphasized breathing patterns, body position, and trigger control with an attention to detail that surprised the SEALs with its precision and effectiveness. Nick Carter was the first to receive Henry's individual attention, and the old Marine immediately identified subtle tension in Nick's grip and breathing irregularities that were costing him accuracy. Henry's corrections were minimal but specific, involving changes in hand position and breathing rhythm that felt strange at first, but quickly began to show results. Within 15 minutes, Nick was shooting tighter groups than he had achieved in months of practice. Alex Turner worked with Henry on trigger control, learning techniques that emphasized smoothness and consistency over speed and power. Henry demonstrated how small changes in finger position and pressure application could eliminate the slight variations that accumulated into larger errors at extended ranges. Alex discovered that his previous understanding of proper trigger technique had been incomplete, missing subtleties that Henry had learned through decades of experience. Paul Davis received instruction on reading wind and environmental conditions, subjects that Henry approached with knowledge that seemed almost mystical in its accuracy and scope. Henry taught Paul to observe indicators that the younger man had never noticed, showing how grass movement, temperature changes, and even air pressure variations could affect bullet flight in ways that modern instruments sometimes missed. Paul's appreciation for Henry's skills deepened as he realized the complexity of environmental factors that the old sniper routinely considered and compensated for. Lieutenant Scott Williams learned about shooting positions and their adaptation to different circumstances, discovering that his formal military training had taught him only a small portion of the possible variations and modifications that could improve accuracy and consistency. Henry demonstrated positions that were not found in any manual, but were highly effective for specific conditions and requirements, knowledge that had been developed through trial and error under combat conditions. Each SEAL experienced immediate improvement in their shooting as they applied Henry's instructions, discovering that fundamental skills mattered more than they had realized, and that their expensive equipment could not compensate for gaps in basic technique. The improvements were not dramatic, but they were consistent and measurable, representing progress that normal training methods had not achieved despite months of practice and instruction. Henry's teaching methods were patient and encouraging, focusing on understanding rather than memorization, and emphasizing principles that could be adapted to different situations rather than rigid procedures that worked only under specific conditions. The SEALs found themselves learning not just about shooting but about observation, patience, and the kind of attention to detail that separated good marksmen from exceptional ones. Commander Morrison watched the coaching session with growing appreciation for both Henry's knowledge and his ability to communicate complex concepts in simple, practical terms. The improvements that his men were showing represented training value that could not be quantified in normal terms, lessons that would benefit them throughout their military careers and beyond. Morrison realized that Henry's visit had provided his team with education that no amount of formal training could have duplicated. As the coaching session continued, the relationship between Henry and the SEALs evolved from mutual respect to genuine friendship, based on shared dedication to excellence and common understanding of the demands that military service placed on those who chose to serve their country. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the range as Henry's impromptu coaching session drew to a close. Each of the SEALs had experienced measurable improvement in their shooting, discovering that decades of combat experience could not be replaced by modern technology or formal training programs. The lessons they had learned went beyond simple technique adjustments to encompass a different philosophy of marksmanship that emphasized fundamental skills and adaptability over reliance on equipment and standardized procedures. Commander Morrison watched his men practice the techniques that Henry had taught them, noting the increased confidence and consistency in their shooting. The improvements were subtle but significant, representing the kind of progress that normally required months of dedicated training to achieve. Morrison realized that his team had received education that could not be purchased or programmed, knowledge that existed only in the minds and muscle memory of those who had learned their skills under conditions where accuracy meant survival. Henry packed his cleaning kit and prepared his rifle for the journey home, performing the same careful maintenance routine that had concluded every shooting session for over 50 years. His movements were unhurried and methodical, showing the same attention to detail that had characterized everything he had done during his visit to the range. Henry's rifle case looked even more worn and humble beside the high-tech equipment that the SEALs used, but everyone present now understood that the contents of that old leather case represented capabilities that transcended mere equipment specifications. Lisa Grant approached Henry with the official paperwork documenting his record-breaking performance, asking him to sign the forms that would make his achievement part of the facility's permanent history. Henry reviewed the documents briefly and signed them without ceremony, treating the record as simply another administrative detail rather than a significant personal accomplishment. His signature joined those of Olympic champions and military heroes, but Henry seemed more interested in ensuring that his rifle was properly secured for transport than in the historical significance of his achievement. Nick Carter approached Henry to thank him personally for the coaching and insights that had already improved his shooting. Nick admitted that he had initially doubted whether someone using such old equipment could teach anything to modern military marksmen, but the day's experience had changed his understanding of what separated good shooters from exceptional ones. Henry accepted the thanks graciously and encouraged Nick to continue practicing the fundamentals that they had discussed, noting that consistency came only through patient repetition and attention to detail. Alex Turner asked Henry about maintaining skills over long periods without regular military training or competitive shooting. Henry explained that he practiced regularly but not obsessively, focusing on quality rather than quantity, and maintaining his rifle and equipment with the same care that he had learned during his military service. Henry emphasized that shooting skills were like any other physical ability, requiring regular use to maintain, but not necessarily requiring intensive training to preserve basic capabilities. Paul Davis, who had begun the day making jokes about civilian shooters and old equipment, now found himself asking Henry for advice about developing better environmental awareness and wind reading skills. Henry suggested simple exercises that Paul could practice to improve his ability to observe and interpret conditions that affected bullet flight, emphasizing that environmental factors were often more important than equipment differences in determining shooting success. Paul realized that his own training had focused on technology and procedures while neglecting the observational skills that Henry used instinctively. Lieutenant Scott Williams discussed with Henry the differences between modern military sniper training and the methods that had produced Vietnam-era marksmen. Henry noted that both approaches had advantages and limitations, but he suggested that current training might benefit from more emphasis on fundamental skills and less reliance on technological solutions to shooting problems. Henry observed that equipment could fail or be unavailable, but fundamental skills remained constant, regardless of circumstances or available resources. Commander Morrison asked Henry if he would consider returning to the range periodically to work with other military personnel who might benefit from his knowledge and experience. Henry replied that he would be willing to help when possible, though he noted that his methods were quite different from standard military training and might not be appropriate for all situations or personnel. Morrison assured Henry that his approach would be welcomed as supplementary training that could enhance rather than replace existing programs. As Henry prepared to leave, the entire group of SEALs gathered to watch him pack his equipment and say their final goodbyes. The atmosphere was respectful and somewhat formal, reflecting the transformation that had occurred during the day from casual amusement to genuine admiration. These men who had begun the morning, confident in their superior abilities and equipment now, understood that they had been in the presence of a master whose skills represented achievements that their own training had not prepared them to recognize or appreciate. Henry loaded his rifle case into his pickup truck with the same careful movements that had characterized everything he had done during his visit. He thanked Commander Morrison and Lisa Grant for their hospitality and for allowing him to use the range facilities, speaking as if he had been the beneficiary of their generosity rather than the provider of an extraordinary demonstration and valuable education. His modesty and genuine appreciation for the opportunity to shoot on a well-maintained range reflected character traits that had impressed the SEALs as much as his marksmanship abilities. The old pickup truck started easily and Henry drove slowly away from the range complex, waving briefly to the SEALs who watched from the parking area. As the truck disappeared around a curve in the road, the men remained standing together for several minutes, processing what they had experienced and discussing the lessons they had learned. Each of them understood that they had witnessed something special, a demonstration of human capability that transcended technological advantages and formal training programs. Paul Davis was the first to speak, commenting quietly that they had just experienced something they would remember and talk about for the rest of their military careers. Nick Carter agreed, noting that Henry's visit had taught him more about fundamental marksmanship in one afternoon than months of standard training had provided. Alex Turner added that he now understood why older military personnel often spoke with such respect about Vietnam-era combat veterans and their abilities under difficult conditions. Lieutenant Scott Williams reflected on the implications of Henry's demonstration for their own training and development, recognizing that the pursuit of technological solutions had perhaps caused them to neglect fundamental skills that remained important regardless of available equipment. Commander Morrison decided that Henry's visit would become part of the training history that new personnel learned about, serving as a reminder that human capabilities could exceed technological limitations when developed through proper training and experience. The range returned to its normal quiet state as the SEALs secured their equipment and prepared to leave for the day. The target systems were reset and the scoring displays cleared, but the memory of Henry's perfect scores would remain in the facility's records and in the minds of everyone who had witnessed his remarkable performance. The brass cases from Henry's M1 Garand were collected and saved as souvenirs, small reminders of a day when an old man with an antique rifle had taught some of America's finest warriors about the true meaning of marksmanship excellence. Henry drove home through the California afternoon traffic, thinking about the young SEALs and their dedication to their military service. He hoped that the techniques he had shared would help them in their dangerous missions, knowing that accurate shooting could mean the difference between success and failure, between coming home and becoming casualties. Henry understood that his skills represented knowledge that should be passed on to the next generation of warriors, ensuring that hard-won lessons would not be lost as older veterans aged and passed away. At home in his small house, Henry cleaned his rifle one final time before placing it back in its leather case, satisfied that he had maintained his skills and perhaps contributed something useful to the military personnel who would carry on the traditions of service and sacrifice that he had learned during his own time in uniform.